A pattern that continually arises is seeing incubators full of human babies. It's places where they march people through, they extract sperm from males, eggs from females, and then the hybridization is happening on these craft with these exogenesis chambers lining the walls of these ships.
This is an emergency broadcast. This is not a test.
Welcome, everybody, to the Dad's Doomsday Guide. Thank you for showing up and listening to the podcast on this lovely Tuesday. I hope everyone's having a fantastic summer. Just fantastic. I personally been trying to, and that's why we haven't had really an episode in a while, because, you know, everybody's schedule is different. It's really crazy, but we're trying to get some new interviews recorded and out to you guys for your listening and viewing pleasure. Today we have a really fun show. I think it's about UFOs, UAPs, consciousness, abductions, all in the realm of this phenomenon. And I think you're going to like it. I enjoyed it a lot. We had Dr. Michael P. Masters on the show. As I mentioned before, he's a biological anthropologist. And it's fun when I have these people on who are scientists. They bring a rational approach, in my opinion, to analyzing the data, looking at what's available. And of course, everybody wants more data, or they want, like tangible stuff they can put their hands on. But there's people out there who are trying to do the best they can with what information is out there. And as you'll see in the interview, we discussed a little bit where Dr. Masters is getting or looking at some of this data, what he's looking at, and how he's drawing these conclusions. It's very interesting, very fascinating topic that I've wanted to cover for some time. And it's in good time, because this week we have the new congressional, hearing, something or other, where they're going to have 3 people come in under oath, three that we know of that they've put out there. And it's David Grush, who, if you don't know who he is, he's a whistleblower who came forward, who says he was part of these intelligence programs, and he has seen documents, photos, I think he said he has seen, that show alien craft, and like we have bodies and people have been killed to cover this stuff up. So that I think will be interesting if Congress does its job and actually kind of digs deeper into some of these accusations and comments that he's made, and trying to find out where this is coming from and how he knows this. But we'll see what people do. And then there's 2 other guests, Fravor, the Navy pilot, and I think Graves is the other one, who they both witnessed. Fravor seeing the Tic Tac. I think Graves, I'm not sure if Graves did the Tic Tac or the other ones. I always get confused about who's seen what, except for Fravor, because I think his story was pretty fascinating. But they'll be on. I think they're great, credible people. I think it's just that in my opinion, their story's been pretty exhausted. So I don't know what I'm going to learn there, anything new at all. But we'll see. Personally, I think this is just hype, and it's going to be hyped up again. It's like a weird cycle that happens. Like everybody, UFO Twitter gets super excited. Oh, we're going to have new hearings. We're going to have people under oath. People are going to spill the beans, and they're going to have these new whistleblowers. And you end up with nothing at the end of it. I don't know. Maybe it'll be different this time, but I've just gotten used to this. Until something like a bombshell drops, I'm not going to be, really optimistic about what you're going to hear. I mean, like you had Rubio on some channel the other week saying like they've had whistleblowers come forward, credible people, multiple people, different people. It's not just one group saying this, and that they're saying really outlandish stuff, like extreme about UFO craft or alien craft and all those other things. And they're trying to protect the witnesses. So I don't think you're hearing from those people. And that's who I want to hear from, right? I think a lot of people do that. They want to hear from those people. They want to see the evidence that those people have. Did they work in the labs or on these bases? I mean, who knows? But I feel like we're so far away from that. But I got a little off topic, or a little down the rabbit hole there with my frustrations with the whole thing. But we kind of get into that too in the interview. Before I forget, please check us out on Twitter. Follow us at Doomsday Dads, at Doomsday Dads. We have like really nice following on TikTok, really nice following on YouTube. Translate some of that stuff into Twitter, which is now becoming X, the everything app. So it's changing the name. It's got a new little logo and everything. So we'd like to further develop our channel and create more content for that. So if you guys can check us out, follow us, that would be fantastic. As always, email us, podcast@dadsdoomsdayguide.com, podcast@dadsdoomsdayguide.com. Could I say that any faster? Email us if you guys want to see anybody on the show, topics covered. We're always on the lookout for that stuff. And if you just want to let us know how you enjoy it, if you think the show's cool, we always enjoy those messages and look for ways to improve. Or if we're doing a fantastic job, it feels good to get a little pat on the back, Leave us a review wherever you may be listening if you feel so inclined. Without further ado, We have Dr. Michael P. Masters on the show. Again, he's a biological anthropologist. He's the author of 3 books that you can check out at your local bookstore or on Amazon. Those books are Identified Flying Objects, a multidisciplinary scientific approach to the UFO phenomenon, the Extratempestrial Model, and his most recent work, Revelation, the Future Human Past. Again, you can check those out at your local bookseller or on Amazon. I think a couple of those are on Audible, which I listen to all the time. So this is not a paid ad for Audible. I just actually enjoy it because I fall asleep when I have a book in front of me and I can't stay awake at night. So I listen to it in the car. My 5-minute drives, shuffling kids. That's where I listen to books. All right, guys. I hope you enjoyed the podcast and we'll catch you later. First of all, welcome to the show. Kind of how did you get started, I guess, in anthropology? And then how did that move to UFOs? And I know for a lot of us, including myself, it's like there's a fascination when you're young kind of and looking at it and wondering about it. But how did that kind of progress to a career?
Well, I don't know if I can separate them, to be honest. I was interested in this since I was a kid and really since I was about 8 or 9 years old. And I saw the cover of Whitley Strieber's book and had like this moment of awareness or this thought that maybe aliens could be us, just come out blasting with that idea for people that don't know why I'm here, where I'm coming from. But it was a simple sort of vision of an early hominin chimpanzee-like creature, a modern human in the middle, and this archetypal gray alien on the side. And really it inspired this question that I've kind of been researching ever since. I went to college specifically for physics and astronomy. And then thought maybe I could investigate this better by looking at, the alleged beings inside who are almost always described as human or human-like. I went into biological anthropology sometime early in my sophomore, junior year, I think it was actually. And it's been great. Yeah, there's tons of overlap between this field and specifically what my research program focused on was the eyes and craniofacial evolution, changes on our neurocranium, the orbit specifically, and how that affects vision in the functional sense, and then the size and shape of our faces as well. So that obviously plays well with the question of who's inside these craft and why do they look so human.
I was watching your other interviews and I started reading your most recent book, Revelation. And I know I don't know where this is different. Like, I know you're talking about aliens potentially being our future human selves. And then there's the idea that they've gone back in time and they've kind of, there's a belief that they've manipulated our genes and made us progress evolutionary wise to a different point. I know there's people who believe that. And then I think you're saying that you think we'll just evolve to this future alien look. How are those two separate ideas, or do you buy into the other one where you think they're manipulating our genes and they're kind of messing with us as we've evolved?
Well, no, I kind of draw a line between those until I see very clear evidence that the former is happening. I obviously tend more toward the latter. And honestly, if you look at these long-term trends in hominin evolution, the most dominant ones are an increase in cranial capacity, encephalization, as we say, an increase in brain size. And with that, as the frontal lobe moves out over top of the eyes and flexes down, the whole basic cranium flexes, it leaves less time and less space for the face to grow out and down like it does in our ancestors and obviously other hominoids who have very long faces and shallow foreheads. And I make an analogy in my first book, Identified Flying Objects, with dogs. You can see it very clearly in dogs that we domesticated. We have Doberman Pinschers and collies and things like that was very prognathic, projecting nose and a low sloping forehead versus a pug or a chihuahua where you have a trade-off in what we call the bow plan, the relationship among those craniofacial features. So yeah, even if we put that question aside for now, I'll come back to it in a second. But if we put that aside, we're still likely to look exactly how these beings are described, with not only the big bulbous heads, small faces, but the lack of pigmentation in their skin. That's a characteristic of domesticated animals. We see it across the board with animals we've domesticated, and we've been domesticating ourselves over the last 30,000 years, and especially in the last 12,000 years since the advent of agriculture. It sort of ramped up and accelerated that trend. So if those trends that are 6 to 8 million years old continue into the future, We're going to have bigger, rounder heads, smaller faces, bigger eyes, lighter skin, but still have all of these traits that tie us not just to the hominin lineage, but to numerous other mammals on this planet, tetrapods with 4 limbs that have pentadactyly, the 5 digits on the end of each limb, and all of these other characteristics. But the most important one is our bipedalism. That's actually the trait that defines the hominin lineage, is that we're upright walking. We're the only primate, we're the only mammal that does that habitually, that does it all the time. So there's just all of these correlates. But so yeah, to circle back to the first part of that question, I get the sense that they're doing it for them and not for us, that there's some reason that they're so interested in our gametes, our sperm and egg, and that it's helping with problems that they're having in the future, rather than them doing something to us that will result in them, that they come back and do to us to result in them, in sort of a bootstrap causal loop kind of way. It's certainly possible, but for me, as an evolutionary anthropologist, to make that claim without extraordinary evidence, I'd need to see the evidence first.
What would you need to see to buy into that? Because I know there's like some big names, and you see it a lot on UFO Twitter, which can be a complete hot mess sometimes, but there is some prominent people.
Time,
Yeah, I got really frustrated with it. We can get to that later, but just
a lot
this
of
whole
people
thing.
are,
Yeah. I had to step away from it. And I wasn't really active on it, but I would use it to consume and kind of try to keep up with the headlines and what's going on. And for that sense,
it's a good
okay.
resource.
Yeah. But I guess what would you need to see? Because there's some people claiming that we hit certain parts in our ancient history where it's kind of I don't know, I'm not going to use the appropriate terminology, but our cranial capacity got bigger, the brains blew up where other things didn't. Like, what do you look for when you look for, I guess, the tinkering evidence? And then how would you explain it as your understanding is right now?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. So we separate the phenotype from the genotype. What you and I are talking about is the phenotype, the actual expression of these genetic characteristics. And that, it's really hard to know if any tinkering took place because it's a macroanatomical investigation. And we have seen an increase, not really in size, but in the shape, a change in the shape of our heads and our faces. In fact, the 2 traits that define anatomically modern Homo sapiens over the last 200 to 300,000 years is what we call neurocranial globularity, where the brain is expanded mediolaterally, and we get these big bulbous heads on tiny little faces. And we have a chin too, because the face is retracted back further to the point where our chin sticks out. So, these things are already happening, and it is happening faster. It's an acceleration. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's related to any sort of alien influence or extra tempestural influence, time traveler influence. Rather, it could just simply be the continuation of these accelerating trends. It happens faster and faster. With that said, certainly if we do start tinkering with our genome on a broad scale, we could accentuate those characteristics. We may do so for possibly designer babies or to help cure disease in our genome, any sort of congenital disease, which could lead to problems in the future, along with current problems that we're having with reduced sperm counts and in vitro fertilization, things like that. If those trends continue and we screw something up in our genome related to reproduction or some heritable trait that's negative, we may have to go back into the past and sample genes from before we screwed things up, because it's the only place to find them. And I think that is potentially a part of what's going on. But to answer your question, what I would need to see is the fully mapped genome of one of these beings. We have a fully mapped human genome that's starting to become more representative of different human populations. But I would also need to see the full human genome of these, what I think are future humans, in order to see what sorts of characteristics they had that they may have imposed on us. Because we can do that with Neanderthals. Now we've sequenced enough Neanderthal DNA that we can see which bits of their genome ended up in us and which part of ours ended up in them. So I think that's probably the only way we could really fully test that and convince people that is what was happening.
Interesting. And so when you base your kind of idea on, you believe they're future humans, you're looking at our own evolution, where you think we'll end up, coupled with, is it kind of an analysis of because the UFO the whole topic is so messy and elusive, and like, what evidence are you looking at? Because, as a scientist, as someone who, looks for evidence, you're not just believing every little hype conspiracy theory that someone throws out there. So it's like, how are you basing, I guess, your belief in these stories besides being anecdotal and being a lot of them are true?
Yeah, there's a couple things to unpack there. For one, we do have the ability to do observational research. I mean, not in the strict sense where we sit down and we observe one culture at one time in one place and figure out all of these things about them using ethnography, but we have enough accounts from enough people that it's not anecdote. You can actually do various analyses on those, one being content analysis, for instance, if you're interested in how often, for instance, people have sex with them, or how often gametes are taken from males or females. You can look across as many reports as you can possibly find, even understanding some of those are potentially hoaxes or somebody got something wrong, because you have that in survey data too, which is a very useful tool in sociology, psychology, anthropology. There are a certain number of those that aren't going to be reliable data, but that doesn't mean you throw out all of them. And there have been surveys done. There's been studies done. The Dr. Edgar Mitchell Free study is one in particular that had upwards of 3,500 individuals, multinational, multi-language study. They're up about 5,000 now with that, and they're continuing to grow their data set. So there is data available. The problem is that we're stuck thinking about this purely in reductionist, materialistic terms, where it has to be an experimental study where we set up cameras and all of these sensors in someone's bedroom, and then the aliens come and we study the craft and we study the beans. That's not realistic. So we need to get out of that mentality and look at this not in the context of how we apply our standards of evidence and our typical laboratory-based studies to this, but recognize that there's a buttload of other ways to do research that anthropologists have been using for centuries, because we can't do experiments on people. So we do observational studies, and you can do hypothesis testing with observational studies in the exact same way. The only difference is you can't claim this thing causes that. Because even if you account for all of these other cofactors, you can never account for all of the cofactors. So there's always going to be something that could come in and be the actual cause rather than something else that you've tried to factor out or tried to find as your independent variable. So yeah, I think it's just, I think it's a limited way in which a lot of people are thinking about science as it applies to this. And in a court of law, I mean, this is already a closed case. But there's, we're somewhere between a court of law and a scientific lab right now. And I think we just need to sort of not change science, not, break science and rebuild it, but just understand that not everything conforms to the rigid way in which we look at the world from a purely scientific method reductionist mentality.
And have you gotten pushback from, I guess, people in your own field, but is it more coming from outside that who won't accept you having to change in this way to kind of view this phenomena? Like, are you getting any kind of, how do you see it in terms of science? Because you'll see the celebrity scientists come on, like Neil deGrasse Tyson and different things, and they just kind of immediately kind of crap on the idea that
right. Well, he's not doing his job. He's not doing his job. I use papers of his in my classes. He's very good at talking about the basics of science, but he's hung up on this thing for some unknown reason to me. And I can't help but think he's paid to be part of this disinformation campaign that we know exists and that David Grush came out and said exists and has existed for a long time. It's nothing new. Scientists have been a part of this divide and conquer strategy since even before Project Blue Book, Project Grudge, Project Sign. They were out here saying, no, it's not UFOs. It's anything but UFOs. The stupidest explanations, still people would eat it up. Oh, it's swamp gas. It's a flock of seagulls. It's, weather balloon was obviously the big one for a long time. And arguably a lot of them were weather balloons. So those prosaic explanations are there. But then you have people, paid scientists, who were meant to just get rid of it, write it off, get stigma introduced so that people don't talk about it. And I can't help but think he's one of those. Bill Nye, potentially too. Adam Frank, potentially. There's these people who just have this knee-jerk reaction who, as scientists, shouldn't. They should recognize their biases. They should understand that our job as scientists is to look at the strange aspects of our reality and to figure them out. Who else is going to do it other than scientists? So, yeah, it kind of pisses me off when you see these people come out here and just throw out these nonsensical explanations, which are getting stupider and stupider by the day. The more real people we have coming out explaining this stuff, and the more actual scientists who are doing their jobs, coming out and doing their jobs and showing that this is real, these people are going to go down on the wrong side of history. And I just don't understand it. It makes no sense to me. Like, you're a scientist, do your damn job.
Yeah. I like Avi Loeb. I think that's how you pronounce his last name. But he
It
seems like
is,
he's
yeah,
at least
fantastic.
curious.
And very, very smart, still respects science, still respects the scientific method, just like the rest of us, but understands that we have to go about this in ways that make sense with regards to something that's extremely mysterious and currently unexplained. But just because the is in front of unexplained doesn't mean it's unexplainable.
Mm-hmm.
It means we should be working our asses off to try to figure it out.
Yeah, I've heard other people say that their frustration with science and kind of not being the ones pioneering kind of the spearhead of this, trying to figure out what's going on. You kind of brought up the Grush and kind of Congress now, and I think Schumer, they're trying to pass legislation. And then I saw Rubio on the TV the other day talking about how he's taking these claims serious and they're so outlandish. Either there's a small group of people lying about it and these intelligence agencies. So how are you looking at this in terms of the government's been so, they lie about a lot of things, or misinformation about, the disclosure stuff over the period, like you said, Project Blue Book. How are you parsing out when people come out and ex-intelligence people too? Like I think Radcliffe came out once and said, hey, there's these satellite photos that are crazy. And you're like, where's this coming from? But yet nothing ever comes out. And then you have people contradict them in the government. So you have this almost like a warring faction. How do you know what to believe and what not to believe, basically? Because that's how I got frustrated with it on Twitter. It was just like, man, I can't. Who am I supposed to believe here?
Well, I don't believe any of it, first and foremost. I don't think anybody's believable other than people whose credentials can be proven. Like, I don't know if you saw that thing on Reddit that came out last week or earlier this week, where it's this person claiming to have worked in a lab and they were sequencing the genome of something that was genetically engineered with human DNA.
I heard about it, yeah.
Interesting AF. If real, huge implications. If not real, no implications, obviously. But there were still things in there that seemed to be relevant in the broader context. But that's not what the question's about. And, well, it is actually, because that person remained anonymous. So there's no point paying attention to it at all, really. I mean, it's interesting for thought experiments, but without being able to validate their credentials, it's worthless in the context of what we should actually be paying attention to and talking about. David Grush, his credentials have been vetted. He is an admirable individual who has no incentive for doing any of this stuff, along with everybody else who jeopardizes their career, myself included, unless you understand that something real is happening and that it's potentially one of the biggest questions of our time, and that it's worth getting this out because a lot of people want answers to this. There's a lot of people who are completely mindless about it. They have no interest in it whatsoever. There's others who dismiss it on purpose because it challenges their worldview. And a lot of humans just like to be comfortable in what they know. They don't want their worldview challenged whatsoever. They want to go on living with what they were taught as kids, teach their kids that. Any disruption to that is challenging. And the mainstream media knows that. So they're not going to push this on people that don't want it either. They're stepping very gently around all of this, tiptoeing around it. With that said, there are a lot of other people who passionately are beating down the door saying, hey, it's time for you to tell us. On the other side of that, I have a very strong feeling that a lot of this is coming from the visitors themselves, that they have initiated this and the government was given a timeline and they have a specific, let's say, set of protocols for getting this introduced to the population in a way that won't cause mass panic, it won't cause mass confusion, it won't tank the economy or cause political uprisings. And they're doing their damnedest to try to stay ahead of this, control the narrative, get a little bit out, pull some back, a little bit out, pull some back, still keep all the same strategies going back to the 1950s with regard to the confusion that stems from all of this and the public's perception, but still at least introduce us to the ideas so that once it is finally revealed, it doesn't just screw everybody up or tank society as a whole. And I can't help but wonder the way it's been happening, especially with regard to the words used and the phrases used and the way things are explained, as I've been watching since 2017 very, very carefully, because I was almost finished with my book in 2017 when that New York Times article came out. I've seen a lot of changes that seem to be very intentional happening slowly, but there's a ramping up of it. So I do think this is different. I do think we're actually moving towards something real, but with the end goal of avoiding some sort of dad's doomsday, I guess, just to circle back to the name of the podcast there. Everyone's doomsday, not just for dads, but it's going to suck for dads too.
Yeah, I've heard other people say this. It's kind of on their timeline, not our timeline. Do you feel that we'll see something for disclosure? I mean, because people, that word's thrown around so much, and I don't know. You right? Just when you think something's gonna, like, the lid's gonna blow off, it seems like it's pulled back.
Well, I think they're trying to avoid the lid being blown off in the first place.
Okay.
To be honest, that's why I think it is pulled back. There is seemingly someone behind the driver's seat with this. It's not just sheer chaos. It feels like it sometimes. But there's people who have known all along what this is, who this is, why they're here, what they're doing. There's no doubt in my mind about that. When Grush came out and said what he did about the crash retrievals and reverse engineering and the disinformation campaigns and the beans that are inside, there's a lot of people that know what's going on. And I don't know if there's a fire that's been lit under their asses or if it's coming from somewhere else. But I do really think this is happening. And yeah, it can seem like 2 steps forward, 20,000 steps back at times. But those 2 steps keep coming faster and faster. And I think there might be a not a floodgate, but definitely opening various dams to raise all ships, to use another cheesy expression, I guess. Rising tide raises all ships.
How do you feel that the public will react, though? And I think I've heard you comment this on this in other interviews, but I mean, how do you think the information would have to come out to where it doesn't cause a mass panic, societal meltdown? Looking at it as myself, I think it was funny. I was talking to a couple other people on the podcast a while ago about it. And it was kind of like, well, after your initial, like, holy shit, something crazy is just got, laid on us, you still got to pay your mortgage the next day. So it's like, do I go back to the same old stuff? How do you see it unfolding?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're all going to take up arms against each other and go find the nearest cave and just shoot it out because, our reality was not what we thought it was. It's definitely, I think it's going to be very much culture shock for a lot of people. The people that have been paying attention might even be shocked about what this actually is and the levels at which it permeates our perceived reality. What we thought the world was. It's not just about UFOs. I think there's a lot more going on with regard to consciousness and just the way a lot of paranormal things in general, those aspects of our reality that we're aware of that are just outside of normal. They run parallel to the normal, which is where that term came from. I think everyone's going to be challenged, but there's going to be ontological shock on a vast scale for people who haven't been paying attention. And I mean, like, really trying hard not to pay attention, or who just dismiss it outright because it doesn't conform to their worldview, like religious people. I think it's going to be hard on religious people. I've heard other people say this, and I think there's a lot that's going to come out about this, especially if we're talking about time travelers. And this was kind of the impetus for my most recent book, is if we're talking about time travelers, a lot of religious worldviews were probably the direct result of instances of interaction throughout the human past, both prehistorically and in more recent historical context, post-agricultural societies. So, they're not going to like that, finding out that everything they've ever believed is potentially the result of something much more explainable that was previously highly unexplainable, which would be kind of a funny oxymoron, I guess. But I do think it's going to be challenging, but maybe enlightening. And like a lot of people say, maybe bring us together in a way that we haven't before. I mean, I think Reagan said that during the height of the Cold War in relation to Gorbachev, as if we faced a mutual threat. We would have to face the fact that we are all one human civilization, despite of our petty differences. And even if we're not facing an alien threat, facing an ontological, epistemological threat might be enough to do that too.
And you mentioned consciousness. I know you kind of hit a few points there that I wanted to talk to you about. What's your worldview, or what's your view of reality? Because I've had people on, Bernardo Kastrup, who's kind of the metaphysical idealism, and then there's a materialism. And I think you've mentioned that you once were one. How do you view, I guess, the fundamental framework of reality? And then how do you see this springing out from that? Because I want to touch on UFO or paranormal after that.
Well, yeah, mine's kind of complicated because there's sort of an evolution to it. I think I may have cited this before, but I do like this quote where Jacques Vallée's coworker, colleague, mentor, Amy Michel, once said that you start out studying UFOs and soon you find yourself investigating Arab mystics. And I can't remember the exact quote because I suck at quotes. I bastardize every movie quote I ever attempt to do, but it's something along those lines. And it's true. I came out of grad school, and even for the first 5 or 6 years after grad school, 10 years, honestly, a staunch materialist. They beat that into your head that if you can't quantify it, if you can't account for all cofactors and all variables, you don't have a strong p-value, low alpha error, and you can't, say anything with any definitiveness. And that's not true. It's important for certain questions, but not every question. Not everything can be boiled down in that way. And cultural anthropologists have been saying that for decades, especially since the 60s and 70s. They did more bong hits than biological anthropologists did, or tripped on acid more. I don't know what it was. But there was definitely this divide within our community in anthropology. They had more of a postmodern view. We had a very reductionist, materialistic view. So that's where I came from. Mm-hmm. And then the more I study this phenomenon, the more I study near-death experiences and read books about it, and psychedelics, various kinds, especially DMT, LSD, psilocybin. And then the UFO experiences people have, very spiritual, high consciousness interaction sorts of things. It really evolved my perception. And I don't know, I guess I was always dismissive of it, just like everybody else, and who comes from that type of background. I was fortunate that my wife is very much the opposite. So she would always challenge me in that way. And once I did start thinking about it more, it all made a lot of damn sense. And so I've I don't have it all figured out by any means, but my views of consciousness, and especially pan-consciousness, and the way in which the material world and the spiritual world interact is fundamentally different than it was even 2 or 3 years ago.
When you look at near-death experiences and the DMT, the ultra real descriptions that people have coming in contact with these entities, are you separating those two things? Like when you're doing DMT, are you seeing these future human selves? And when you're dying and you're seeing the near-death experience, you're maybe seeing some level of consciousness, universal consciousness, or how do you look at those two things? From
my own experience and the research I've been doing, I've come to think that there is a universal consciousness that somehow uses light or energy waves to propagate. And energy waves are timeless. Light is timeless. Photons are timeless because everything in the universe is relative to the speed of light. So in that sense alone, all time exists all at once. There's also, I'd recommend Eric Wargo's book, Time Loops, because he talks about how in quantum mechanics, the photon may even already know its final destination, which helps explain the nuances of the double slit experiment and other variations of that. But we see time as linear. This is a big problem for when I'm explaining this theory to people, is that we have it in our brains. We're taught since we're in kindergarten, cut out these pictures and put them in order. Which one happened first? And so we train our brains for that, but that's likely, and there's very good evidence to suggest that's not the way that time actually works, especially in the block universe model. So consciousness seems to be timeless too. I've had precognition my entire life. I know things that happen weeks before, sometimes decades before they actually happen. I knew my kids before they were born, my wife before I met her. And I've experienced that, I've seen that. But I've also had intense experiences where I feel like there's a communication taking place in that realm, fortunately without having to be dead or near dead in order to experience that. And the telepathy thing that's so commonly described, I think that's an aspect of our higher consciousness where we evolve to a point where we can just bypass all of this vocalization and communicate with the vocalization of the mind, that vibrational energy that seems to be an aspect of this all-encompassing, timeless consciousness. So, yeah, I do think it's related. I do think people get a glimpse of it. There's a very good chance that that's home. There's a very good chance it's the thing that people describe as heaven in Christianity or, in any of these other religions. It's kind of been bastardized by the way it's been interpreted in like this horrible game of patriarchal telephone that's been played over millennia. But there is probably a truth to that. And we're all feeling the same thing. We're all interacting with this same sort of overarching spiritual realm that may even be a simulation. Who knows? Rizwan Virk makes a solid case that potentially we are in the computer, and that light, that communication is just the signal from the mainframe computer, and we're just some iteration of that. Can't discount that, it's something to be considered. But my own personal view at this point is that human consciousness is evolving to the point where it almost exists as this entity unto itself. And we interact with it as primitive versions in dream states, in hallucinogenic states, in near-death states, and potentially in these UFO encounters where we interact with the beings who have that more evolved consciousness. So I do think they're related, but I definitely don't think that UFOs are just some spiritual manifestation. They do appear to be physical things that come into our physical reality and crash into our physical sand and leave physical bodies. So there's certainly that aspect of it. But when we talk about the overarching aspect of who's inside in relation to what's inside these, I do think there's a lot of overlap there.
So maybe those things have evolved to a point where they're more closely related to consciousness or in tune with consciousness than we are right now. So maybe that's why we're having these kind of odd crossovers, because you're right. Like when you talked about maybe things, them traveling, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm not understanding you, traveling back in the past, which obviously your book references, and doing certain things maybe for themselves, that we at that time viewed that as a religious experience or a supernatural experience because we didn't quite understand it. Is that kind of...
Yeah.
And then maybe the mix up with that, and now people are having near-death experiences, and then some people are doing, psychedelic mushrooms, and like, where is all that fitting in the reality, how we explain things and learn about stuff?
Yeah, and in a very odd, nuanced way, I try to integrate all of that into my most recent book. What I've learned about the material aspect of how these craft work, the spiritual aspects, the higher consciousness, the way in which interacting with those highly technical craft and the higher intellect beings who occupy them may have inspired various religions and have, actually, not just may have, but the Nation of Islam is considered a UFO religion because I talk about this a good bit in my second book, The Extratempestrial Model, and Stephen Finley at the University of Georgia has written numerous papers on this, where all of the leaders of that church talk about UFOs as an aspect of their overarching belief system and where the religion came from and what they learned from interacting in the mother wheel, as it's called. So, yeah, it's, they at least own it, which I think is pretty sweet. A lot of other ones are like, oh, no, UFOs aren't real. Screw all that. We're creation of God, and that's all monkey business because God only created us here and nowhere else. So extraterrestrials are just made up. So yeah, I do think that there's overlap in a lot of those capacities. But no, even without, religion, you go into one of these craft, you look into the eyes of these highly empathetic, highly intelligent, highly conscious beings, it's going to change you and your worldview. And I've talked to countless people who it has. They come away from that with a deeper understanding of spirituality, and ego goes out the window. There's no more sense of self. You become a part of that universal consciousness when you are brought into that world and realize that you're just one small part of all of it. There is no I, there is no ego. And that's going to be probably, going back to your earlier question, one of the hardest things for people is that's what we have. This society, we live in a meritocracy, a capitalistic meritocracy. How much more ego-driven can you be than to be raised in this thing where our entire economic and political system is built around individual achievement and individual wealth. So yeah, it's going to fuck some people up for sure.
Now, when you reference, I guess, because I've heard that too, is like the life-changing experience when people have these encounters, but not all of them are positive. And I've had this conversation with somebody else. It's like they kind of gave me the analogy. Well, is the lion evil that eats the gazelle, or to him he's fine, but to the gazelle he's totally evil. So then you look at people maybe that are just misunderstanding some of these abduction reports, because some of them get kind of crazy, and then you kind of couple in some of the paranormal stuff, whether it's and maybe those two shouldn't be mixed, because if we're talking about something in the future coming back, and we should leave consciousness out of it for that argument. Why are people having, I guess, bad experiences? Or when you've gone through the research, what are you seeing as common themes? Or is this do you think it's misunderstandings, or do you think there are certain aspects maybe to this that aren't kind from our viewpoint?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest questions. And fortunately, there is data out there to help answer that. And it's the question being asked at the International MUFON Symposium in August next month, where I'll be giving a talk, friend versus foe. Are they friendly or are they our enemies? That's important.
Grush mentioned it too, right? In his talk, he was like, there's been some encounters that weren't friendly.
Sure. Yeah. And it's easy to, pick and choose those, or just focus on the negative, or just focus on the positive. And I think we're all guilty of that, and we should recognize our selection bias in doing so. But fortunately, that was one of the main focuses of the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Free Foundation study. And what they found in their 2019 publication with about 3,500 contactees and abductees is that people who interacted with the more human-like beings, and I should mention too that they found that the most commonly described form in these UFOs on board a craft was human. Not humanish, human-like, but human, just like us. Behind that was the small grays, tall grays, and then hybrids. And all four of those, by definition, are hominins, because they're upright walking, bipedal humans. But the ones that had interactions with the ones at the top, the more human-like individuals, 85% had a positive experience. That's a very important thing to keep in mind. 85%, it's a huge majority. After increased contact, even one extra case in which they interacted with these more human-like beings, it goes up to 95. Only 5% had what could be conceived as a negative experience. And in fact, a lot of them, Whitley Strieber is a great example in his book Communion, and then the one he co-authored with Jeffrey Krapel, The Supernatural, which is a great book, a Strieber Krapel collab. But he talks about how he had this intense sexual experience with this woman, this future human woman, alien woman. He doesn't call them extraterrestrials. He calls them visitors, travelers, things like that. But he longed for further contact. Even before the sexual encounter occurred, he fell in love to some extent. He had a very deep spiritual conscious connection with not just her, but the others he interacted with. Some, seemed a little shady or more like robot-like, or sort of like battle droids. I forget what he called them, but the ones that actually carried him around by his arms, he didn't especially love them. But the ones that he, is interacting with in these other ways, he longed for that. And you see that in these other reports too, and statistically in the Dr. Edgar Mitchell study. So I think that's important to keep in mind. But that doesn't mean we can just put on our rose-tinted glasses and look at the entire phenomenon through that lens. There are people who have negative experiences. There are some people that are harmed, but those tend to be a very small percentage of the overall sample of people who do have interactions.
And would you not rule out that maybe it's another life form that's interacting in that way, or do you still think it's this future kind of human evolution chain?
It's certainly possible. I mean, I don't completely discount the extraterrestrial hypothesis. It's also possible that those ones where it's a negative interaction, the less human-like ones are still human. They just come from a point in our evolutionary future where they're so far removed from us that we seem like primitive little lab rats. And at that point, where do you draw the line? going back to the eating analogy that one of your previous guests made, like we tend to eat cows and pigs and horses in some societies, but we draw the line at like cats and dogs and things like that. We don't eat gorillas or chimpanzees outside of some parts of the Congo and other regions. But we already do this. We draw a line if it is a universal consciousness at some place, because we do stuff to eat, and even plants may have consciousness. Even rocks may have consciousness, which is still hard for me to think about, but it's possible. So I think maybe if we're talking about, these humans that are only separated from us by 100 or 200 years, they're going to feel more of our common humanness and interact with us in a way that maybe they even still have the same IRB rules or the same human ethics board rules, where they have to legally in interacting with us as research subjects from their past. Whereas if we're talking about humans from the very distant future, who maybe have gone through so many iterations of destruction and rebirth, they see us as so primitive that, it's like eating that cute little rabbit. You don't really want to, but it is delicious, So it's hard, but it's like, we got to do this job. It's harder to connect with you because my consciousness is so evolved and you're this freaked out little coke rat that I've got to stick something up its butt and hope it doesn't scream a lot, but it's going to, because it has no idea what's going on. And I've got big scary eyes. Like, that's going to, whether you were physically harmed or not, that's going to freak you out.
Yeah. So
when somebody asks you in a survey, how do you perceive this experience? You're like, it fucking sucked. Like, it was horrible.
Yeah.
Like, they jammed stuff off my ass and they scared me with their big eyes, and they didn't even talk to me. They talked in my brain. And what's that? I didn't know that was real. So yeah, I think it depends on the person being abducted and the ones doing the abduction.
So when you talk about the probing that's done, often reported, I've heard you describe that, why there would be a reason to do that, because it's often used as kind of a joke, from South Park to everything else. What is the reason that they would be doing that type of stuff to people and continuing to do it? Because it seems like people go, oh, well, if they should already know everything about us, like, why would they still need to be doing all this kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think that was one of the very first episodes of South Park. Yeah. I remember watching that in college, like, oh, wow, first episode of the show's about aliens and butt stuff. That's kind of fun. And then a giant satellite dish comes out of Carmen's ass, I think, at the end of it. God, I remember that like it was yesterday. I've probably seen it 100 times since then, too, actually, since
I've seen more clips and reruns, I think, on social media and stuff than I probably ever see anything new. I just don't see the old stuff.
New Futurama, though, late this month. I don't know if any of your listeners are a fan of that, but they're getting like their 5th reboot.
Oh, my God. I can't watch anything like, I have a 6, a 4, and a 2-year-old, so the TV's consumed like at all hours of like kid shows. And
yeah, but Futurama's a cartoon, bro.
That's true. Come on, kids.
Best of both worlds. Like, I watched Phineas and Ferb with my kids all the time because it was like animated, but hilarious and smart. Futurama is one of the smartest shows that's ever been on TV. Still a cartoon.
Yeah, that's true.
I forget what the question was.
I think, why are they probing still?
Oh, yeah, the probing. Yeah, that's a great question. And I heard this question come up on the Cryptid Factor podcast once with Reese Darby, Dan Schreiber, and Buttons is what they call him. Leon Kirkbeck's his real name. And yeah, they made the case, like, why not just ask? Why not just say, hey, what'd you have for dinner? Because what I've argued in the past is that the anal probe is to get fecal matter, because you can learn a lot about people's diet from fecal matter. But again, why not just ask? Well, I think a part of the reason is because a certain segment of the population that gets abducted is extremely freaked out by what's happening. And you're going to, be taking skin samples and looking at their teeth and fingernail trimmings, shove something up their butt, or even if you don't, if you try to get around that, like sit down with a little pad and paper, say, okay, what would you have for breakfast? And yesterday for lunch? Very good. Any juice this morning? Like, nobody's going to answer that if they're like screaming their heads off because they have no idea what's going on. They're inside of a UFO right now. So I think that's part of the problem. And then my editor actually pointed out in reviewing my second book, The Extra Tempestra Model, that it might be a lot more than just diet. They might be interested in gut bacteria and the whole biome that exists within our stomachs that they may only be able to get through those means, and not just about us individually, what we ate. I do think that's, part of it, but potentially about our entire environment. What's going on in this micro environment that reflects that macro environment, which I thought was a really great point. And I asked if he wanted accreditation for that, and he said, no, just stick it in there. So, but that was his idea, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But yeah, I think it is important. You've probably heard me mention before that with coprolates, with dried poop from caves, we can figure out what Neanderthals ate, which was about 7,000 calories of mostly meat products. They had a much higher daily caloric intake than us, and almost exclusively meat products, which is pretty unique to that group. So yeah, you can learn a lot from poop, and I do think that's why they do it. It's clearly an uncomfortable aspect of what they're doing, most likely for them too. I imagine the ejaculation machine is not exactly a fun procedure for them, other than a couple twisted extraterrestrials who also get off on it. But I think for the most part, like a lot of the stuff they have to do, it's like going to the doctor. And actually I had an abductee tell me, I mentioned his encounter in my second book. He told it to me. I asked him if I could mention it without his name. He's like, I don't care, throw my name in there. Ellis Martin's his name. Great guy. Was abducted and had anal probes done to him since he was a kid. And it really traumatized him. It screwed him up, as it would for a lot of people. He didn't know if it was real. And that's another thing, playing into the friend or foe thing. I think, why would they try to mask our memories of this? Why would they try to use screen memories and hide what they did from our conscious memory if they weren't trying to help us? Mm-hmm. And as I pointed out in my second book, the people who have a great time, who get shown the craft, who get to walk around and, see the kitchen and the bathroom and learn how the machine works, their memories are never wiped. It's always the people that come in screaming, who are freaked out. And I think it's to protect them. It's not to protect, the identity of these travelers. They don't care. They just show up and, do whatever to these people who aren't scared. So I think that's another indication that they are friendly. But so he had this done. They erased his memory, and he eventually started to remember more and more. And he said he read my book, the first one, and he was like, it helped me so much with my own conceptualization of this, because suddenly it wasn't this creature coming across the stars and just violating me in this way. It was like going to the doctor, because, they were humans. They're trying to collect data. They're doing studies. They're trying to learn about human physiology, diet, whatever. And so it really helped him in his conceptualization of what happened, because he started to see it as like a doctor visit, which was something he could conceptualize in his normal reality. And I've heard others say that too.
So when you talk about the ones who look more human are closer to us in the evolutionary timeline, and then the ones who look like, I guess, the grays would be the ones in the far, far future, I think I've heard you mention hybrids before. Where do those fall in? And are those typically, I guess, the evidence or what we have, are those like the far future ones breeding with more of the closer to us and then coming back? Are they walking among us? The hybrid thing kind of like blew my mind, because I was like, wait, what? That's like, what was the, I know it's probably not the same, but the Battlestar Galactica and the Cylons or whatever, and they were like human versions and walking around. I was like, so where, how did you stumble on this, and kind of evidence wise, what are you looking at?
Well, I mean, anything related to an investigation of this is looking at patterns, looking at recurring themes. Because you can't always trust any one individual's account unless you have credentials or it's been validated by multiple people. As J. Allen Hynek had a whole scale for assessing these, as strangeness criteria and reliability criteria. Was it just one person that has a claim, or were other people there? How many people saw it? How weird was it relative to other things that could be explained prosaically? So I think we should all adapt that and try to do that in assessing any of these. But a pattern that continually arises is seeing incubators full of human babies that look a little bit alien. I talked about the Terry Lovelace case in my second book, and he was walked through this triangular craft, what I've come to call a floating fertility facility, not just because it's an alliteration, but they seemingly do that. It's places where they march people through. They extract sperm from males, eggs from females, and then the hybridization is happening on these craft with these exogenesis chambers lining the walls of these ships. And that's been reported by other people too, not just him. And then, the obvious question is, why? Does this have something to do with problems with reproduction in the future? I go into a lot of detail about this in the extraterrestrial model, because I do think it's an important question, and also societally, what it might mean for humanity if we do move reproduction outside of the uterus and into an exogenesis chamber. There's a lot of social and economic impacts that could be felt from that as well, especially for females. So, if this is reported enough, you kind of have to pay attention, or at least try to understand what may be happening. And as you pointed out, there's a very good chance that if you do have people from different times that have very different phenotypes, as I mentioned earlier, the phenotype is the physical expression of the genotype, what you actually see. If we have people that are separated in time and you average those phenotypes out, they would be able to look like anyone that lived at that time, and potentially and most likely still retain a lot of those cognitive abilities, the clairvoyance, the telepathy, the future knowledge that seemingly exists with future humans. So I think that can help explain the ancient human hypothesis, the ultra-terrestrials, the crypto-terrestrials, especially the jinn, the genies, people that had ability. Jesus, I think it explains Jesus, for God's sakes. The angel Gabriel, they have all of the same characteristics that you see described in cases of UFO interaction with these highly intelligent beings that, again, I argue are future humans. They have that clairvoyance, future knowledge, healing powers. It'd be so easy to heal all of these stupid diseases of the past that we've already cured for the most part by now, in the year 2023. So I don't know, the levitation, walking on water. There's so many things that just seemingly point to the same sorts of things that are described with regard to these ships, and especially with anti-gravity, time manipulation, knowledge of future past diseases. I think all of it should be considered, and especially in the context of this reported hybridization program, because you could have those people look just like the people of any time and any geographic region through that hybridization, and through what's likely to be a much more sophisticated system of genetic manipulation than what we have now. Like we're all boned up about CRISPR, which is great. We can do a lot of stuff with it. But I'm sure in another 100, 200 years, it's going to blow that out of the water.
So you would say when you look at those ancient cave drawings and stuff, and you see like these things on the walls, and people, I think you see it a lot on those different shows that kind of go back in history and say, oh, those are depictions of other beings visiting. Or do you believe that? Are you think there's evidence for that? That's not just for hype and TV?
I mean, anytime you introduce TV into anything, there's going to be hype. I learned that the hard way, because it's entertainment, and to keep people's focus for more than 5 hours, you have to make things entertaining. Even if it's, I'm a nerd. I love science, so I'm entertained by like the really dry science stuff. Like, give me the facts, give me the cool stuff. Don't water it down with all this, hyped up bullshit, 'cause I don't want to see that. But the rest of the population does, other than nerds like myself. So they have to do that. I think you can still present factual information and still have it be dramatized and embellished a little bit without fully taking away from what you're trying to demonstrate. So, and that has been happening more. I feel like we've sort of bounced off the Ancient Aliens extreme, and kind of even Ancient Aliens has reversed direction and are trying to pull back a little bit, believe it or not. I've been working with them for 4 or 5 years, and I've seen a dramatic change in that show. And it's a pendulum, that's always moving back and forth. So, no, I do think a lot of those are probably them trying to represent to the best of their abilities the same things we're seeing now. And I do think that is a further indication of this time travel model, because if we have the same big-headed, big-eyed, small-faced, seemingly magical beings that we see now, that people describe in the historic record and the people are depicted in the prehistoric record, it's potentially, maybe just as a simple analogy, the exact same people and the exact same craft being recognized and depicted in various ways based on the technology and understanding of the people at those times. So yeah, I do think they're probably seeing the same thing. And, if you're going to draw something on a cave, you're going to draw what you see. You're going to draw what you know. I had the fortunate experience of visiting Lascaux Cave in central France a couple months ago. And they drew what they saw. They drew the stags and the horses with distended bellies and all of the things in their environment. And, if you're going to have something like that happen to you, if something like that comes into your environment, well, why wouldn't you depict it if you had the ability to do so?
Mm-hmm. It'd be kind of weird for us to just discount, well, that's just a bad drawing, but the other stuff, we can trust what we see on the other stuff, like the animals and stuff. But when it gets to the weird alien looking creature, let's just dismiss it because we don't believe it, probably some of that.
It is easier to do so, absolutely. But, and if it was just one, let's just say it was one in one place. Yeah, you could dismiss that. But if you see it over and over again in carvings and, in Nazca with the owl man, big-headed stone thing facing up toward the sky, like if it was just that, yeah, it's easy to say, well, they're just crap at making art with rocks on the side of a hill, Is it an owl? Is it a man? It's an owl man. Who knows? But when you see it over and over all across the world, and not just that, the intentional cranial modification, that's so ubiquitous throughout the world and going back tens of thousands of years. And it must have sucked for the kids and the mothers and the dads in this scenario where you have your kid strapped to a board and you squeeze its head until its forehead is like this.
Yeah.
Like, why subject yourself and your kid to that form of physical torture unless there's some reason? And why would it arise in all of these separate civilizations throughout the world? So the logical explanation in my mind, in accordance with all of the carvings and the cave paintings that we see, is that they were trying to look like the gods. And there was even one society that reported that to an anthropologist who investigated it. They said their ancestors were instructed to do this so they would look more like their gods. So yeah, we need to be skeptical. We can't just believe everything on ancient aliens or most of it. But we also need to recognize these recurring patterns across the world, and especially when they do show such consistency, despite being in various and highly different cultures in very different places.
Yeah, because the argument is they've had no contact with each other, right? These different places. I mean, they had no way of knowing each other's cultures or customs, and like they all had these odd, peculiar, similar things popping up across the globe. Is that kind of the thought?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, like those consistencies with the intentional cranial modification. But on the flip side of that, like pyramids. I've heard people make that claim with pyramids. That's kind of dumb because the best way to make a structure so it doesn't fall down is start big and make it smaller. Anybody could figure that out. Yeah, they probably started with squares and then there was a tiny earthquake and they all died. And then those people never made another building because they're all dead. But then the ones in a neighboring village were like, oh, let's try this. And that worked. So then they passed that down. So humans were smart. Back then, they had a lot of resources at their disposal. They had engineering. They had ways of working stone. So, yeah, when people say, like, aliens built the pyramid, I call bullshit on that. But there are other seemingly consistent things that arise, behaviors, material culture that we see across different groups that does seem to bolster the argument that they were being visited by the same things we see today.
And are you thinking of these visitations as kind of, besides getting things that they need or want, when we view them as the gods, do you view these visits kind of as tinkering with our history to get us to go a certain path? I know there's some of those beliefs from people. And then obviously you get the rise of religion probably out of a lot of these visits or the gods. Do you see those as intentional? Like, I've heard the argument that, religion was needed for us, so we kind of developed in a certain way, and then that would fall away and all that kind of...
It's hard to make that case because everything they've been doing in our time period and leading up to it in recent history has been very much akin to the prime directive of Star Trek, just kind of a hands-off approach. Let them do their own thing. However, if there are people who are being told to reshape their skulls because we tell you to do it, that's a pretty overt cultural interjection there. Yeah, I heard an argument that religion was interjected to save humanity from war or something, which sounded completely asinine to me because, as Einstein said, ever since there was one God, there was fighting in his name. So it seems like we've had more wars because of it, which would make sense from their point of view if it was sort of a population control thing, because clearly they're concerned about the earth. That's one very, very commonly described thing. John Mack wrote about it a lot because it was a theme that kept coming up with all of his patients, that there's this take care of the earth thing, where they don't really care about us per se, but they are concerned about the sanctity of the planet, which I feel bolsters the extraterrestrial argument even more, because why would they care if they have their own planet? But if they're stakeholders in this planet and they inherit it after us, I made a very crude analogy with porta potties at a music festival in the first edition of my second book, and my editor's like, you should take that out. And I did. But I wanted to keep it, so I'll tell you now. I don't think I need to. You get the gist of it. But they have to use it after us. They're the ones standing that line behind a bunch of sorority guys that are about to go in there and just destroy that thing. Half of them probably doing the green apple quick step, and then you go in there to do your thing, and it's just a mess. And that's potentially what they're looking at and inheriting this planet from us. So yeah, it makes sense why they would care if they are future humans, but not necessarily if they're extraterrestrials. But I don't know if they care about us, and especially if we're all just some manifestation of universal consciousness who, don't matter as individuals. There'll be others. There'll be other ways in which the consciousness can enter a body at a higher state, and then they die, and the higher state, the more evolved state, enters into those bodies. So yeah, maybe there's a binge and purge that happens. It's kind of a weird way of thinking about it, but
no, that's interesting, because I've looked at some of the reports, and it's just, if they are there and they are watching us and they have been back and forth, there's been a lot of suffering and a lot of horrible death, and they've, relatively not interjected to stop any of that. So then probably don't care about us. And then to your point about consciousness, it is interesting that potentially, if we go in and out of this world, and I've kind of evolved too, because I grew up religious. I'm a Catholic, but I tend to view it now as religions are kind of the different ways up the mountain to kind of discover consciousness. And after kind of looking into idealism and stuff, it's very attractive to me.
Eastern religions and idealism, certainly, I think they were ahead of the curve on that.
Yeah, it feels that way, because a lot of things fit neatly into that versus trying to talk about suffering, talk about death, and trying to make that work within an all-loving, all-knowing God. And the arguments for that.
Which are innately contradictory, many of them, especially the relationship with God and the devil. Like, if you can create this thing, why not just destroy it? There's a lot of other things like that, but I see what you're saying. Carry on.
Yeah, and it's like, I watched my dad passed away in 2020, and he got cancer, and it was just really horrible to watch. And it's like, he was our hero and a good friend, and I've thought about all these things before in terms of religion, but after that, just the same stories, they don't work for me. I can't do the original sin, the fall, and I just have to kind of accept it and have faith. You know what I mean? I understand people who come from that. I know it helps people. I know it helps people like make sense of life and stuff. But when you hear it in the context of, hey, there's this consciousness, and it's trying to learn about itself, and everything that can happen will happen. And then we kind of go back home after, and it drives with NDEs, DMT, it drives with all these different things. It's like, that feels right. I don't know. I've kind of went on a tangent there, but
no. I'd like to actually bounce off that if I could, because that was one thing that I left out of my little rant about consciousness earlier, is that Not only had I already kind of come to believe exactly what you just said about how there's this evolving thing that we come from the home place, get into these bodies, learn, and then send that back up, which I've come to believe dreams are. I think every night we're uploading what we experienced, we're emptying the hypothalamus back up into the universal consciousness so it can evolve. And we do our job. We're here, these physical bodies through senescence expire, and then we come back into another one, and I think that helps explain people's past lives and the memories that they have from those too. But what was crazy is that I had already come to that conclusion. I really struggled for like 5 or 6 months, a few months ago, like what is this? This isn't real. What the fuck is it? And it was really stressing me out for a long time. And I'd drink some beers and sit around with my wife. We've always had really intense, philosophical discussions. I'm like, I'm just stuck. I don't know what the hell this is. It's not real. What is it? What's the meaning of life? We all do that. But it was different because, I've been having, experiences that challenge that. And then, if you think about it with the near-death experiences and past life experiences and things like that. But what was really funny is that this week when that Reddit post came out, if it's still available, scroll all the way to the bottom. And this person who alleges to have worked on this, whether that's true or not, talks about seeing documents where these beings were alive and interviewed about their worldview, about religion. They don't have religion anymore, but they describe the exact same damn thing that you and I are talking about.
Weird.
This evolving consciousness with different iterations that bring information up at these levels through what biological beings see as linear time. So it was kind of like, well, that's a strange synchronicity that I happened to get to that place in my own thinking, whether it's true or not, I don't know. Nobody knows. But then to see that and then to hear you say the exact same thing is all very interesting.
Yeah, and it's helped me kind of try to make sense of some stuff. Like, you're right, you don't know. I think if you're one of those people who has had an NDE, maybe you're more confident in that. But I've talked to multiple people who've had that, a doctor who researches that. And he was saying, people will go in kind of with a very structured view of religion, kind of where they come from, and they'll come back with like new ideas, like reincarnation's a thing, and all these different things that don't jive with what their original religion was. And I think that's so fascinating. You can't just discount that. You know what I mean?
No, they experienced it. They're the only ones that have. We should be listening to them more than anybody standing at the front of a big congregation on Sunday saying whatever the fuck they want to. Like these people actually saw the other side and came back, and that can still be God. These don't have to be mutually exclusive. That can absolutely still be God. Like I said in the earlier part of the show, I think we're talking about the same thing. I think that heaven is that universal consciousness, that spirit world that is home. When we come down here, we go back home. And it does help with death of loved ones too, because you'll see them again. You're always there, except when you're here. And maybe you'll even get to come down together again. People talk about soul sisters and things like that, where you sort of form these spiritual bonds in that realm and then enter together to grow up and be with each other again in these different bodies. So I think there's a lot of ways it can manifest itself.
Yeah, I think people get hung up on the image of God too. It's like the beard, the clouds, and it's like, well, I think now I've had to, if you have this conversation with someone, you have to like, well, let's define God first. Because we might, we're not talking, when I say God, I might be thinking more of like a consciousness thing now than I am talking about, the white guy in the sky on the cloud. And I don't think
it's funny you say that too, because I'm listening to an audio book called The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, Ekkerttolle, and he said that exact same thing. He's talking about the teachings of Jesus and Buddha and Confucius and others, because they're important. And they were tapped into that world, but he hates the word God for the same reason you just said, is it conjures up this notion of a white guy in the sky, and it's impossible for it not to. Yeah. So he tries to use other words that haven't been tainted by people's personal stigmas or experiences or stereotypes or whatever.
Yeah. And I'm not saying in all cases, but in some cases, you'll even get someone who maybe describes himself as an atheist, but if any of you explain it kind of this way, it's like, maybe, yeah, maybe that's possible. They'll be more open to that. But if you say God, it's like, No, you know what I mean? Because they're thinking about that same thing, you know?
Yeah,
Now,
it's a roadblock for people. The most
yeah.
common religion right now, or at least the fastest growing, is spiritual, not religious.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole new category unto itself because so many people say that. And I think it's really telling that we're not all just becoming atheists or agnostic. We're not becoming purely secularists. We're just realizing that there's been this bastardization through time of the original teachings that probably did come directly from that space and that spiritual world, and dismissing those, but recognizing that those teachings are important because it's about love and peace and harmony and caring for each other. And we would all be a lot better off if we focused on that and less so on the interpretation over the last 2, 3, 4,000 years of those original ideas.
Now, I know some people don't like to answer this, but and so you don't have to if you don't want to, but have you ever had experience with like DMT or anything? Or known anybody, if you want to put it that way?
DMT, no.
Or ayahuasca was some of the other ones where you kind of have seen this other place. Because I've never done it. I've thought about it. And I'm just like, man, that'd be really interesting. Because I have, you know, these. You hit a point in your life where you have these kind of philosophical questions. You know, like I want to know the truth. I want to know what's real.
Yeah.
And that seems like a way to do it because I don't want to die and have to have that experience.
Right. And people don't die from them. I had a buddy that tried to overdose on acid once just to see if it was possible. He wasn't suicidal or anything. He was quite confident that you couldn't. So he ate something like 100 doses of acid, an insane amount of acid. And it was a horrible, horrible experience, as you can imagine, but he didn't die.
Yeah.
You know? So he's like, well, check that box. Can't die. Yeah. Moving on. But no, I've had many, many transcendental experiences myself. Not on ayahuasca, peyote, or DMT, but certainly numerous others, numerous times.
Okay. And did that help you come to any of these conclusions that you kind of have now, or help maybe make things more clear? Or is it tough to bring back? Okay.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, you can't bring things back from the other side. That's not true. I used to think that. That's not true any longer. There is the potential for developing a more direct line of communication that I think is always there. And I have found that it's not even necessary to have those substances once you realize the reality of that space and the reality of the interaction that's taking place with it. And I think we all have that all the time, but it's easy for it to feel like, you know, a voice in your head, or you're just imagining things, you're talking to yourself. And that is certainly the case. We all, or at least 50% of people, have an internal narrative. But when you do have an interaction with that gate being opened, with the key going into the door, and especially if that correlates with a physical interaction with the same beings who are put in physical form, then it's undeniable. And yeah, you can certainly recognize that there is a very real place, you know, and it's probably fundamental, and it's probably some aspect of our fundamental consciousness that's originating from.
So it'd be fair to say when we die, you believe we go back to the consciousness. Would that be a fair characterization of your beliefs at this point in time? Or,
I mean, yeah, it can only be a belief, I guess. And it's funny because I went full circle at this point. I was raised in an extremely evangelical, strict Christian, born-again Christian church type family. Recognized the hypocrisy in a lot of what was being done versus what was being taught. Divorced myself from it to an extreme extent, and then circled back to the point where I'm like, wait, we're talking about the same thing. You guys just made it suck. I don't know how you did this. How did you ruin this thing that's love and light? You turned it into this bullshit, hateful, racist thing. I don't get it. But no, yeah, I'm back to where I started, I guess. I do think, and especially talking with so many people and reading so many books about near-death experiences, like that's home. You know, you go home, you can see in all directions at the same time. You can move effortlessly. There is no time, you know, like, and people are there. It's love, it's light, it's all the things that are described about heaven, just outside of the book that ruined it for so many people.
And on the religious note, what do you think about that report when Grush came out and said, hey, the Vatican helped hide the Italy UFO? I was like,
Yeah, that was interesting.
Wait a second.
I know. I didn't know about any of that. And it put it back. We've always put the line at Roswell. Now it's back to like the 30s, 31, 33.
That's Mussolini. I was like, wait a second.
Yeah.
What's going on?
I know. I did a little double take on that too.
When you hear that, I know you had a really good point earlier. You said if someone comes at it with no credentials and says something, I read it, it's interesting, then I dismiss it as that's not part of my evidentiary, I guess, process or what I seek to find out about this phenomena. But when you have someone like him say that, now I know it's kind of secondhand from him as kind of the thing when people say about him. But what do you make of that? I mean, it's funny because it's the Vatican and it's like all this conspiracy and you're just like, you add another layer, like they have helped hide a UFO. But do you dismiss this?
No, I don't, because I think he claims to have seen documents. He hasn't seen a craft, but others have too. I think Diana Pasulka wrote about this too, or has talked about it. The Vatican has been involved for a while, and they always have been. And it's hard to say they because we're talking about different popes and different leadership, but as an institution, they seemingly have been more in the know or more accepting of UFOs than any other religion, as long as I can remember. And you can't help but wonder if maybe that's a part of why, because they saw it. You know, they saw the damn thing. It's hard to ignore it at that point. So, I think there's other things that certainly corroborate his case. Not that it necessarily needs to, because, you know, he was right in there with all of these different programs throughout their history. And certainly he doesn't have the level of access and clearance that a lot of people do. You know, I'm not trying to get Majestic 12 on this or anything, but it almost seems like there has to be that's what he's trying to call out, essentially. You know, not Majestic 12 by name, but these shadow governments, these shadow programs. That's kind of his main motivation, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, that seemed like a thread through his stuff. It's like, hey, this isn't right to hide from humanity. Now, have you been ever approached or contacted, or have you contacted anybody, any physicists or any working like with like who know, you know, the rumor mill that kind of comes out where you have information fed to you, or intelligence people? Have you ever had any of those interactions?
Yeah, I have. Some have been in person, some have been through email communication. So obviously the ones in person are easier to validate than the ones that are email. However, with that said, the former intelligence people who have reached out to me on email claiming to be former intelligence have told me things that were extremely helpful for understanding very nuanced aspects of the phenomenon and helping to fill in a piece of the puzzle that I didn't have prior to that communication.
Interesting.
So whether they were or they weren't, they definitely were contributing something that I overlooked, and maybe they're the only ones that could have seen that I was overlooking that in the first place.
Interesting.
So yeah, no, it has been interesting. There's people that know. There's people that know exactly what this is, and I think that's starting to come out, and I think we'll see more of that.
It's people always use it as kind of a knock. I know we're getting close to the end here, so it's a few more questions for you. But for like crash retrieval programs, I guess there's kind of two parts to this. Is the fact that I think you've mentioned that they were either people are assuming that they're crashing and we're just finding them, and the knock is like, why is something so advanced crashing all the time? And you were like, well, no, I think it's gifted, deliberate, like doing certain things. Like, can you talk a little bit about that and kind of how you view this whole crash retrieval program? And I don't know if you would dispel the idea or dismiss the idea that, hey, these are just bumbling idiots from the future.
Well, yeah, I've heard that asinine argument as well, that they're flying across from, Alpha Centauri with the sophisticated technology and they crash when they get here. You picture Gomer Pyle flying a UFO or something. And yeah, that's kind of, That would seem dumb, actually, if they were extraterrestrials. Hey, we made it. They're like, he falls asleep or he's drinking beers the whole way. Finally, it's like, oh man, I'm too drunk to drive.
Like, oh,
but it would make
shit,
sense.
There's lightning. Oh God.
Yeah. What is this shit? Never seen that before. But no, if you do think of it in the context of the extratempestrial model, like we're fallible. We crash things all the time. They're fallible. They crash things. Hey, we got that in common. We suck at driving stuff. So yeah, I think maybe that could be seen as an aspect of future human development, and also, moving across space in the same time. We do that all the time, and we still crash. I almost crashed today because somebody decided to pass somebody in a double yellow, coming 70 miles an hour at me on a 2-lane road. I was like, well, that was dumb. Unfortunately, I pay attention and I stopped, but I definitely flipped the bird. Actually, it was a double bird in this instance. Now that I remember, I was kind of pissed about that. If I hadn't been paying attention, I'd be dead. But I think too, like moving in and out of space time, like we can't even conceptualize that yet because we can't do that. We can move through space in time, but not move in and out of space time. And, people say, well, the Earth's moving this fast, and none of that matters because that separates space and time. We're talking about one entity. We don't have to figure out where the Earth was 5,000 years ago to get there. We just move through space time as one holistic entity, but there's still bound to be more difficulties associated with that. But as far as whether we're gifted things or they crash, clearly some of them crash. I had never argued, or if it came across this way, it's not what I was trying to say, that they crashed things intentionally. Grush made it seem like they set things down. I think he explicitly stated that some things were just landed. I think he used that exact word, landed. Other things clearly crash. I think that's an accident.
Okay.
What I've always wondered is there enough time between now and when they're coming back from that they know that's going to happen? Do they have historical records where those pilots get in that thing knowing it's the last time they see their families? And they have to do that because it's always already happened. And it's a part of the block universe. Those 2 points are connected in time. I don't think that's the case because the ones that crash, to the best of my knowledge, are the ones that have these very gray human-looking individuals. And how many times has history probably collapsed and been rebuilt? I lived in France and traveled or lived 4 or 5 times in the last 25 years. And everything there, and especially where I was in Tours, a little bit south of Paris, numerous places in Paris too, archives are smashed and rebuilt. Libraries are smashed and rebuilt. I remember the Taliban in Iraq and Afghanistan would blow up historic figures and carvings and sculptures and libraries. Actually, that was our fault when we went into Iraq because we guarded the oil ministry. We didn't guard the Natural History Museum, and shit was just looted. We lost some of the most iconic artifacts from the origins of agriculture in Mesopotamia because we guarded oil, not the artifacts. So shit gets lost is my point. I don't think they know they're going to crash. I think those are legitimately accidents that happen. And there's a lot going on in these craft. There's no doubt about that. It makes sense that they would crash sometime. It's what he was saying about the landings that are interesting to me. And if they are landing in one place, do they have to land in another place? Are they socially obligated or politically obligated to give Zimbabwe a craft or South Africa or Bolivia? Most people would say China or Russia there. I would like to get away from pretending like China and Russia are the only other people in the world because I'm so fucking sick of it. So I'm going to say Zimbabwe and Bolivia. Are they required to give other advanced civilizations in this time craft to make sure that everyone is on an equal footing? And then it's about who can reverse engineer this the fastest if a crash did happen. But I think if there were no crashes, they would still be absolutely covert with everything they're doing. But I think it was those accidental crashes that pushed us to where we are now because we are reverse engineering them. We're starting to become them already. And they need to start focusing on how they get between those two things, between them showing us what they have, between us being the ones that have that eventually, and when we figure out in the middle that it's been us all along.
Do you think we're flying them? Like there's been reports that some of the stuff we see or people see is actually us. We've achieved some kind of, not mastery, but able to put these things in the air. Do you think that's happening?
I don't know. I mean, I remember seeing videos as a kid before they really fully blocked off Area 51 and when stuff was probably still happening there, of craft flying around, seemingly doing flight testing. If they are, I don't think they're using them to their full capacity, where they have the ability to manipulate time in the same way, which I think is what fully unlocks the space travel aspect of these two, because they're not just moving through space along some sort of linear temporal trajectory, but actually moving through and manipulating the flow of time in and around these craft, which I talk about a lot in my second book. That's very, very commonly described in these cases. So if we are flying them, I think it's probably, and this is just wild speculation, I'd like to separate that from things that I do know more about. Wild speculation, I would say that we have figured out the anti-gravity aspects of it, which is seemingly pretty simple. From what I can tell, it's just electromagnetic manipulation, since it's 10 to the 40 times stronger than gravity. But I don't think they're actually capable yet of doing the temporal manipulation. But I don't think that's far behind. I have a feeling we'll be the ones going back in time in the next 100, 200 years.
Wow. And could you just, before we kind of wrap up here, explain the block universe? Because I know you're talking about, is that the past, present, and futures already happens kind of like one container and you can basically go and see anything at once? But then that, to me, it raised the question, well, if things are already decided, where's the start, where's the finish? I know that's a kind of a flaw in the way people think of it probably. And it brought in like questions for me, like free will, like what are we even have a choice in this? Or things just happening and unfolding in a way that history and the future has to?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like an author's going to plug their books, but I don't write these to sell them. I write them to inform people about things. And I lay out the way we have come to understand time. We don't understand it. Ask any physicist, they'll say, or they'll be narcissists and tell you don't understand it and you never could. So I'm not going to try. They'll gaslight you is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
My second book goes into it in more layman's terms, and brings in the insights of philosophers and even some pop culture references, because they went deep into it in the End Game, the Invincibles. That's
was it? Avengers, right?
Avengers, yeah. Avengers End Game. A lot of that focused on time travel, and they consulted, you could tell, because they had some really good quotes in that. The show Dark, also, I mentioned that, a lot of German show on Netflix. I recommend everybody check that out.
Oh, that is so good.
It's so good because they adhere to the block universe model, and this is likely the way it works. We don't know how it works yet, because we, as biological beings, perceive time as linear. We also know time is an emergent phenomenon. There's something fundamental that we don't yet understand. Until we do, we're not going to fully comprehend how to travel back through time. But if we do, yes, the block universe model looks at all moments in time, from the very first moment of the Big Bang to the very last moment of the universe, as all being part of one massive four-dimensional block of space-time. And when you move throughout that, in the same way that you can jump from one piece of a paper to another, you're connecting these dots on a piece of paper, you're not changing anything in there. You're just visiting those periods. And if we think about it in our sort of indoctrinated, unilineal, linear belief system of past to present, or past cause, future effect, that goes out the window with a time machine. We can go back and have a future cause and a past effect, but it doesn't change anything. Because in the block universe, you're always going to go there and do that thing. Any change you made was already integrated into that system before you ever left to go do it. So it's not like you get home and it's raining donuts and your wife has 4 heads and your kids were never born. That stuff doesn't exist in the block universe. So we think of these paradoxes, but they really don't exist in the block universe because of this inherent self-consistency that exists across all moments. They're all connected, and they always have been, and they always will be. You can move in and out of them ad infinitum, And as I talked about at the end of my first book, I think, that would be awesome at some point once we do have full disclosure, and if they are future humans, that we go into a cafe and you hear somebody speaking a language from 1,000 years in the future. In the same way that you go to a cafe in France or in Moscow and you hear all of these different languages, most of which local to that place, but also other languages because they're big cities and people travel through space. We could have that situation where people just travel through time. We could have time tourists that just live here all the time. They walk among us. They're already walking among us, but they could walk among us without having to hide themselves anymore. And I think that would be a really cool place to be.
Yeah.
I don't think we're far from that.
For yourself, when you're doing all your research and stuff and you looking ahead in the future, have you hit a point where you've kind of exhausted kind of what you can do in terms of looking at like this past evolution, kind of deciding, well, maybe this is where we're headed? Do you now need disclosure? Do you now need evidence to be brought where you can start kind of, updating your hypothesis and whatnot? Or what do you do research wise? What are you looking for to happen?
Oh, it's so funny you use the word exhausted. Because around about a year ago, almost last summer, I was so tired and I really wanted to just quit all of it. And no, it turns out there's a lot more to explore and a lot of different ways to explore this. This last book is a good example of that because, the first book lays it out in sort of concrete, multidisciplinary scientific terms. It's kind of a dense book. The second book is more stories. You can kind of sit there and listen to what happened to people, but I bring the science into it. And then the third one was largely for me to both keep it interesting, but still bring in a lot of things I'm not allowed to talk about in a scientific book. So that was something that really allowed me to add like a trilogy thing to it. Hard science, still scientific, also hard science, but science fiction, where a lot of what's in there might be truth. It's just written in a way that liberates me and takes the chains off, so to speak. So I think the three of those appeal to very different people, but still get the same points across. I've never been asked that question. I've never really thought about it, I guess. But if I'm going to answer it honestly, I'd say, maybe this is a bit of a holding period where I feel like those are out there. People can look at them. They can get a sense of how this might apply to what's happening now and what is to come. But I don't feel a strong urge to write something else. The first book took me 7 years. The second book took me 3 years. The third book took 9 months from conception to publication. But I don't feel like there's anything I need to write down. There are new ideas that come, but through these types of conversations, it's possible to talk about those and sort of explore them with intelligent people and, an interesting framework like what you have here. But I definitely don't feel like this overwhelming urge to just sit down and write something. I think we're all kind of waiting for the next shoe to drop, and I'm certainly one of those people.
And what are you watching? Who are you watching to kind of see that shoe drop? I mean, do you have little pieces, whether it's government officials or whether it's sources? Do you look at something to get that info? Because like we talked about earlier, I referenced UFO Twitter being kind of a hot mess. Do you have a particular go-to when you're waiting for this to happen?
Yeah, that's an important question because, and I got this a lot. I gave a talk at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur with all PhDs in various fields. Nobody into UFOs at all, except for the host, Jeff Krapel, who dabbles. It's not his main area of interest, but I got that question a lot. Like, this is suddenly interesting to me. This makes a lot of sense. What are some good jumping off points? Because I don't want to just go into this cesspool of ufology and come out smelling like shit and learn nothing from it. Like, what's a good starting point,
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of what you're asking too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think people that do their job, people that do work, You know, like I mentioned Diana Pasulka earlier, Ross Coulthart. A really good podcast, or people, not just podcasts, but people, or Nathan and Darren King, Exo-Academian, both PhD level experts in different fields of the humanities, social sciences, they take time to talk about things. You know, they sit down, they don't really have guests on or anything, but they sit down and analyze things, both what's happening, but also like historic perspectives that come together in their narrative. They both have a couple different podcasts where they express those things. Yeah, I like the things Sean Cahill expresses. He seems to be grounded in this and kind of sitting back watching, but also espousing, you know, that we're all in this together. Let's stop the bickering. Lou Elizondo said that many times as well. And I think that is where we're going as a species. So when people say things like that, I do kind of take the rest of what they say to heart a little bit more. But yeah, you know, people should be selective. I get the sense that your show also is about UFOs to some extent, but not entirely.
Yeah, I've wanted to get more into it. It's hard. Like you said, it's a cesspool until you kind of look around like, who can I have on? And you're like, you know, you like start trying to grab people. And then some people have done the circuit and they're exhausted. They show up everywhere. They're on everything. So you try to bring something new, you know, like figure it out.
I was there last summer. You do get reinvigorated though. There's ways to check that and get back. But yeah, no, that's true. And then some people don't evolve what they're experiencing and seeing and hearing, you know, so it was hard for me to answer your question because I'm not writing anything new, but the way I'm thinking about this is constantly changing. And I think it is for a lot of us. John Ramirez is another person. Like I remember he was on, and I would welcome anybody. I'd hope someone would check this because I remembered seeing him on Andy's show, that UFO podcast, and he'd done a string of them. You know, he'd done like 5 or 6. And he was like, yeah, this will probably be my last interview. I just don't feel like I really have anything else to say. And then all of a sudden, he's saying a lot of new stuff with a lot of insights, a lot on numerous different podcasts. And I'm like, I paid attention to that. I saw that flip happen. And I have some ideas about why that I can't talk about here, and we're running out of time anyway. But when stuff like that happens, that makes me pay attention more.
Okay.
You know, and it wasn't that he was burnt out. He just felt like he said everything. And then all of a sudden he has a lot more to say.
Yeah.
And I think that's happened to a lot of people involved in this for various reasons. But yeah, he's another one I would pay attention to. I think he, not just because of that, but for other reasons, has insights that people should absolutely listen to. And people are. I mean, you look at the numbers that him and Coulthart are polling, there's a reason for that. People trust them and they trust their credentials and that they're not just feeding people bullshit.
Well, I can't thank you enough for spending the time. I really appreciate the conversation. When I was watching your other interviews, I was getting excited to talk to you about stuff because of the whole consciousness thing and all these different elements to this, the world we live in. So thank you for that. And if anybody wants to learn more about you, your books, your information, you have so many interesting interviews out there. Where can they go?
Well, unfortunately, I stopped updating my website. I used to be
so much time.
It's so much time. I used to be so judicious about it. And it's not hard. It's just, that got
it's the procrastination of like, I don't want to sit there. I don't want to do that. I don't want to update links. I don't want to add links.
Copy, paste. Like time can be spent doing so many more things. And so I did those things. So don't go to my website for interviews. I don't know how. Google maybe like the year and then the interview. But yeah, the books are available anywhere you can buy books. And I always encourage people to go to their brick and mortar bookstores to get them, help out a local business. I'm not talking about Barnes & Noble. I'm sure that was implied when I said that. But I just realized they're a brick and mortar that is local for a lot of people. I live in a small town, so we don't have one. But
okay.
I don't know. Just be. We'll find each other.
Sounds good, sir. Well, thank you so much again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott. It was great talking to you. I appreciate you having me on.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and our other social media platforms to stay updated with our latest content and join our awesome community. You can find the links right down below in the description, and also feel free to check out these suggested videos popping up right now. We'll see you at the next one. Learn, prepare, survive.